Last year, the South African Language Board declared that hashtag land expropriation without compensation was the word of the year. It was the most significant meme on social media in South Africa. It's really part of our political moment right now. And of course, this came about because the ANC, at its elective conference in December 2017, adopted a resolution that said that it would promote land expropriation without compensation. We can talk about how that evolved and who was pushing it, but very clearly the ANC adopted this position, which many of its members do not agree with. And the last year or so has seen the folding out of the implications of that moment. Last February, Parliament the EFF promoted a resolution to establish a constitutional review committee to look into changing the constitution to provide for expropriation without compensation. The ANC, pushed into a back corner, agreed to that. And so this committee was established. And what we saw during 2018 was, in a sense, a bit of political theatre. There was an unprecedented level of public engagement with this process. More than 700,000 written submissions were submitted. That is on a par with our constitution-making process in the 1990s. Normally, or legal processes attract 50 to 100 submissions. This was 700,000. There were hearings held around the country. The overwhelming response from ordinary people was, yes, change the constitution. The overwhelming majority of the written submissions said, no, don't change the constitution. So I want to try to, in a sense, unpack what all of this means for you. In a sense, we've asked the wrong question. We've asked ordinary people, do you want the constitution to change? All the constitutional law experts argue that actually our existing constitutional framework is adequate. It provides for just and equitable compensation, as I'll show you in a minute. But the broad public sentiment is that the state has failed. For 25 years, there was expectation that people would get access to land for urban residential properties, for rural farms, and it hasn't happened. So there's deep dissatisfaction. But I also think that the only way to really understand what's happened in the past year and a half is to understand the divisions within the ANC and the ways in which the land issue is, in a sense, a symptom of that deeper division. So let me give you a little bit of a brief introduction to the political and historic issues around land ownership in South Africa. If we look at this map, this is a map of South Africa at the end of apartheid. And what we see is the designation of the Bantustans, the 10 so-called homelands. And of course, the question then became, how are we going to redistribute assets, and particularly land, particularly fertile land that is an important asset in our country? And one of the questions became, how do we enable people who are living in the communal areas to access land elsewhere in the former white RSA? But also those who are living as farm workers and people in informal settlements, how can people get secure access to land? So remember that in 1955 we had a freedom charter that said the land shall be shared among those who work it. But we still do not have policy clarity about which land should be shared, among whom, for what purposes, and what are the outcomes that we're looking for. And I think that that's very important. Rather than chasing numbers like the number of hectares, we need to say what kind of change in our economy and our society do we want to see? What would success look like? And we do not have that. So let's look at how this has gone. Importantly, the shape of this geographical disparity was shaped by the 1913 Natives Land Act, but in a sense that confirmed dispossession that had already happened. The ANC, which was founded the year before that act, and very much in response to this issue of the land being designated on a racial basis, has gone through very significant changes over time. Initially, the ANC, or the SANNC, as it was established in 1912, was focused on the need for private ownership rights for black people. It wanted black people, and it was very middle class. It was professionals who established this institution. So I think that it's important to understand that there was that moment. From the 1940s onwards, there was the Youth League that pushed a more radical approach. And from the 1960s, with the Communist Party, there was an argument within the ANC and a resolution from 1969 at the Morogoro Conference in Tanzania that the land, the banks, and the mines should be nationalized. So that's a very big shift in the ideological positioning of the ANC. By 1988, at the negotiations around a new constitutional dispensation held in Harare, the ANC agreed that there should not be nationalization, and that in fact there should be a mixed tenure regime with private ownership, public ownership, cooperative ownership, and that there should not be the seizure of property without compensation. So, we've gone through various iterations, and I want to bring you into this moment of the 1990s where the Constitution was crafted and how it is that we've moved from the 1990s to now. But first, let's just look at a range of different land questions. Here we have a gentleman in the communal areas, congested communal areas, people wanting access to land outside the communal areas, as he managed to get in the commercial farming areas. There's also black commercial farmers who want to be working alongside their white counterparts. And of course, white commercial farmers are very keen, particularly Agri-South Africa is keen to have black counterparts joining the industry and deracializing the existing structure, but without changing the ways in which land is held and worked. So it's about a deracialization without a class change. Land reform was envisaged as a mechanism to overcome spatial apartheid. So if you're flying 37,000 feet above South Africa, one can see from the aeroplane the distinction between commercial farming areas and communal areas, both in terms of land use and settlement. There's a deep divide that hasn't been transcended. Similarly, with urban areas, suburbs and informal settlements and townships. So in a sense, that's what we're wanting to address through land reform. Now, let's also be very real. I think that what's also become very clear over the past year is that land reform is not all about farming. In fact, we have an urbanizing society. Over 60% of our population is urbanized, and a lot of the demand for land is for well-located land in the cities. And we've seen this after February last year, the EFF and other groups promoting the idea that people can occupy land. So I think that is very important to bear in mind, that we have migration from rural to urban areas, we have de-agrarianization. Do people really want to farm? Well, many do, but many want land for other purposes as well. I want to emphasize also that as we look at Section 25 is the property clause. In 1995, when this was being negotiated, the ANC initially didn't want to entrench property rights in the Constitution because they're covered in the common law. But there was a big push from the National Party, the Democratic Party at the time, that there should be constitutional protection of property rights. My view is that actually what the ANC did was it turned that around, and it said, okay, we'll have a property clause, but it will not insulate private property rights. Instead, it will be a mandate for transformation. And if you look at what's in Section 25 of the Constitution, the first clause says no one may be deprived of property except in terms of a law of general application. We can't have discriminatory laws. But we can expropriate as long as it's in terms of a general law. Also, not only for public purposes, but also in the public interest, which includes land reform. We don't have to pay market price. We must pay compensation that is just and equitable, taking into account 5 factors: the current use of the property, the history of how it was acquired, its market value, past state subsidy and investment, and also the purpose of the expropriation. So this is very clearly a mandate for the state to embark on land reforms. And then it says there must be redistribution. The state must take measures to foster conditions to enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. There must be tenure reform. There must be land restitution for people unfairly dispossessed after 1913, which is the date of the Natives Land Act. And then I think that we haven't paid enough attention to Section 25(8), which says no provision of the section may impede the state from taking legislative and other measures to achieve land, water, and related reform, to redress the results of past discrimination, etc. In a sense, this is an override that says the state may embark on land reforms regardless of any other provisions of this section, as long as it's advancing transformation. So in many ways, we have a property clause that doesn't insulate private property rights. It is a mandate for transformation, but the state is responsible to account for how it does that. So let's just talk about what has actually been happening. Perhaps this isn't clear, but I'm going to talk you through it. There have been 3 periods broadly aligned with the Mandela, Mbeki, and Zuma periods. We have consistently the state has bought land at market price, right? Even though the Constitution says you can expropriate. The state has chosen to embark on a market-based approach advised by the World Bank Mission in the early 1990s. There's been a change, whereas in the past there was transfer of title, now the state is the buyer and is actually leasing out land. So the state is becoming a bigger and bigger landlord and very poorly able to manage all of those properties. In terms of the class agenda of land reform, who is it for? Initially, it was very explicitly for the poor. In fact, it was linked to the housing grant. You had to show that it was means tested, so you had to show that you were poor. From the Mbeki period onwards, that was removed. And so now we have an unclear question of, like, is it big commercial farmers, or is it smallholders? Is it women? Is it farm workers? Who's meant to benefit? And then we also have a significant change, whereas initially it was for poor people to do whatever they liked with land, to have a secure place to stay, to have multiple livelihoods, to start a business. Now we see that there is increasingly an emphasis on commercial agriculture. So there's been a very significant change over time. And importantly, I would emphasize that while the rhetoric around land has been increasing over the past few years, actual delivery has been plummeting. So if we look at the high point of delivery of hectares, that was 2007, 2008, the end of the Mbeki period, and we see the Zuma period basically collapsing. And that's partly because only 0.4% of the national budget is allocated to land reform, and there's very weak capacity within the department. Now, one of the big questions that often is raised is, well, who wants land? Do people really want land? Well, actually, the data tells us this. 45% of Black South Africans want to have land. Not necessarily rural, it could be urban as well. But nearly half of those want 1 hectare or less. In fact, the demand is for small holdings, well-located small holdings, either urban, peri-urban, or rural. And only a third want this for food production. Many people want a place which is a secure place to stay. Instead, our government has been allocating big farms to big commercial farmers, spending vast amounts of money on few people. So we've been very poor at distributing the benefits. Interestingly, also, there's a lot of questions about, well, do young people really want land? Do they want to farm? Half of the demand for land comes from 18 to 35-year-olds. So young people are wanting land. They want well-located land. And I think that also this is how some of the politics is playing out at present. In terms of the distribution of land, who owns what in South Africa, we actually have very poor information. But around 2/3 of land is white commercial agricultural land. We have the communal areas, the former homelands, plus a bit more, other state land and urban areas. So clearly, I think the question that many people are asking, well, which kind of categories of land are going to be expropriated? And who will be compensated and who will not? So I'll try to deal with that. Overall, over the past 25 years, we have distributed about 10% of white commercial farmland. This is a far cry from the target, which was to redistribute 30% in the first 5 years. That was the target in the RDP in 1994. So in 25 years, we've redistributed about 10%, but we know that a lot of people have been repossessed because they got into debt. So one of the other things that I think is very important to address is the ways in which we have failed to integrate the commercial farming areas with the communal areas. if we look at this map, it actually shows it's an index of multiple deprivation. So if we look at whether people are in a formal dwelling, whether they have access to education, running water, etc., we take all of these measures and put them into an index. And the dark blue areas are the areas of greatest deprivation in the country. And what we can see is that actually the Bantustans are intact. Politically, they were dismantled, but economically, these are the areas of greatest deprivation. Bear in mind also that there's this enormous conflict around commercial investments in these communal areas. 25 years into democracy, we have failed to engage with a clear legal process to secure the rights of the 30% of our population who live in these areas. They live on top of very valuable land. You know, a vast amount of the world's platinum resources are in the form of Botswana and Leboa. So we have valuable resources, poor people on top of them, with weak land rights and poor governance. And this is what is causing massive conflict. 2 weeks ago, 6 people were murdered around a conflict around a mining investment in KZN. It's happening in Northwest as well. So we need to be aware of that. In addition, one of the big questions that many people are saying is, in 2014, just ahead of elections, the ANC announced that it was going to reopen the process for people to claim land through restitution. So the Restitution Amendment Act was passed, and there's been a massive influx of new claims. We did some work for the high-level panel, which was chaired by Kgalema Motlanthe, former president, and appointed by Parliament. And looking at the pace at which we're settling old restitution claims, it will take 35 years more to settle the claims that were lodged in the 1990s. To settle the new claims that were lodged after 2014, we estimate around 143 years. So political promises have been made that cannot be realized in practice. It is really serious. And I think that political expectations are now aroused, and I think that we really have a crisis around expectations from the state, that it is not able to do. Yesterday I looked at the budget speech and the actual underlying estimates of national expenditure. The budget for the Land Claims Commission to deal with restitution claims has been slashed by 30%. So we're going to be slowing down. We're going to be slowing down. We need to bear in mind with that. Let me continue. So just to come back to the question of the property clause, the debate over the past year has been, should we change the property clause to make possible expropriation without compensation? I really recommend that if anyone's interested in this, you go back and look at the ANC's resolution from December 2017, because it doesn't say we're going to expropriate everything without compensation. It's very specific. It's very specific. It talks about particular categories of land, where there are absentee landowners, where there are hopelessly indebted properties, and so on, vacant land. So it's actually quite specific. And what I would say is that what's important to bear in mind is that there are different approaches and understandings of what expropriation without compensation means. When the EFF talks about expropriation without compensation, they're talking about nationalization of all property and vesting of that property in the state. Now, my own experience of looking at this approach where the state is buying up land and leasing it out to people and trying to extract rent from people, it's a disaster. The state doesn't have the land administration capacity to do that. So I think that there's one approach, which is nationalization. Then there's, some people think, well, every time the state acquires property, it must expropriate, and it must expropriate with no compensation. I don't think that's on the cards. The third possibility is that the state selectively expropriates when it's necessary to do so. In other words, to break a deadlock. Say there's a land claim, and the property owner will not sell at the price that the state is willing to offer. The state must expropriate in the interests of transformation. That's what the Constitution says. And it can offer a compensation that need not be at market value, and in some cases it could be set at nothing. So, but only in selected contexts. So I want to emphasize that this issue of the just and equitable compensation is really what's being debated right now. One possibility, of course, we remember that while this debate has been going on the 31st of July last year, the president came onto TV looking a bit haggard after an NEC meeting at about 10 or 11 o'clock at night and said, we're going to change the constitution, even though we don't need to. He was clearly pushed into a corner. Then on the 15th of November, the Constitutional Review Committee from Parliament released its report and said something very similar. They said, we want to, the Constitution or the property clause should be amended to make explicit what is already implicit, which is that as long as it's just and equitable to pay no compensation, that can be done. But it will be tested on a case-by-case basis, and it will be subject to review by the courts. In other words, we're not looking at a blanket acquisition of land. We're looking at case by case. You're going to have to argue whether you pay market compensation, below market compensation, or in some cases, zero. So that, I think, is where we're at now. So I want to just clarify, the Expropriation Bill. The Expropriation Bill is actually, I would argue, more important than the constitutional amendment. The Constitution may be amended to say the state may pay no compensation, but it will still be on a case-by-case basis. It will still be subject to the Limitations Clause, Section 36, and it will still be subject to judicial review. What's more important, I think, is the Expropriation Bill, and this was published on the 21st of December last year, and it made explicit in the provision 12.3 that it may be just and equitable for nil compensation to be paid where land is expropriated in the public interest, having regard to all relevant circumstances, including, and then it goes, where there's a labor tenant, in other words, there's a black farmer who for generations has been on a white-owned farm but has been working and providing free labor. Where the land is held purely for speculative purposes, where it's owned by a state-owned corporation and other state-owned entities, it's very encouraging to see that Public Works has been doing an audit of all of their properties that potentially could be made available, particularly for urban land reform, to make available undeveloped, well-located land in urban areas for low-income settlements. Where the owner of the land has abandoned the land, or where essentially the state has already subsidized this property so much that it should not subsidize it again. In other words, whites who benefited extremely from apartheid should not benefit for a second time. So that, I think, is the broad thinking around land expropriation without compensation. I sit on the Presidential Expert Advisory Panel on land reform. We're having our second colloquium tomorrow and the next day in Pretoria with a wide spectrum of stakeholders. And this is broadly the perspective that is emerging, which is that land expropriation without compensation can never be applied across the board. It would be inequitable. In fact, most people who are dispossessed of property rights in South Africa are black and poor. So we need to have a differentiated approach and approach different situations in different ways. So I think that the question of expropriation has been very hyped. Expropriation is actually quite a cumbersome process. It takes a lot of time. We're likely to be tied up in the courts. What would be the best things that could happen now? Firstly, I think we need to have test cases going to the Constitutional Court. So even though the ruling party in government has had this power to expropriate for land reform since 1996, it's never used it. The Mala Mala case several years ago, you might remember, where one family was paid out R1 billion. It was going to go to the Constitutional Court, and the minister decided just to pay out the asking price rather than contest it in court. So the Constitutional Court has never interpreted what is just and equitable. How do we balance the interests of the public and the taxpayers and the fiscus versus a particular family or company of landowners? So we don't have the jurisprudence, and I think the test cases are going to be important. My prediction is that over the next 2 years, we're going to see quite a slow and laborious process. We're going to see probably an amendment to the Constitution. It's going to be probably minor and clarificatory. We're likely to see the Expropriation Bill being enacted into law, and we're likely to see several test cases coming before Parliament.